Thank you so much, Lou. And as Lou indicated, there are a number of states doing these genuine progress indicators now. And there's no reason it couldn't be done in South Carolina. Why not a South Carolina genuine progress indicator like some of these other states? It's a good thing to think about. And in the state of Maryland, correct me, Lou, but in the state of Maryland, as I recall, it wasn't done by a legislative action. The agency took it upon itself to prepare the genuine progress indicator.
Yeah, the Department of Natural Resources, which tends to be the point of origin for a lot of these efforts, came up with it, presented it to Governor O'Malley. He loved it because he was already a stats guy. And then they've gone from there, and now they're working to figure out, well, how do we actually operationalize this, which is a whole different set of challenges. But.
Right. So it can be done in a variety of ways. It's legislated in Vermont. Now, our third and final presenter is Josh Silver. Some years ago, Josh co-founded and served for 9 years as the CEO of a group called Free Press, which has done a lot in our country on media reform and other actions to improve media operations in our country. But now he started a new initiative called United Republic, and they have launched a new project called RepresentUs. And he is addressing the critical issue of ethics reform in our country, in our Congress, and we'll deal with this, I hope in his presentation, with this core issue of money. The money in our politics and what to do about it. David Orr had to leave, but as he was leaving, he said to me, we've got to talk more about the money. And so I'm hopeful that Josh will do that, but he has the floor. Please.
Thank you, Gus. Good morning. Now, usually in the South, when you say good morning, everyone says good morning. One of the things I love about the South. My name is Josh Silver. This presentation is going to be focused largely on the slides, so you can orient yourself that way. But before you do, I think I do want to mention Bob Edgar, who was going to be on this panel today and who passed away very suddenly, the president of Common Cause and a real a mentor to so many of us in the public interest space, and more importantly, just a heck of a guy. So I just want to recognize that we are all suffering, both as a country for him not being with us anymore, and as a group here today, because he was going to be part of this panel. Now, this presentation is about how we fix this problem, which is an obsession of mine. And it's about the fact that our political and economic operating system, which is, of course, the name of this panel, has cancer. And I'm not talking about the kind of cancer that afflicts the human body. I'm talking about a cancer in the form of corruption. And I'm not talking about this kind of corruption. This is the most fun kind of corruption to poke fun at, of course, Blagojevich from Illinois. I'm talking about the corruption that is legal. I'm talking about the corruption that has been described very, very articulately by this man, Professor Lawrence Lessig, now from Harvard University, formerly of Stanford, and a real pioneer, what he calls dependence corruption. Less about bags of money under the desk, but more about some of the statistics that follow. And yes, Gus, it's all about the money. 2010, 0.26% of Americans gave $200 or more to political candidates. 0.05% gave the maximum amount allowed under law to a political candidate. 0.01% of Americans gave $10,000 or more to politics. And in 2012, so our most recent election, this is the humdinger, buckle up, 0.000042% of Americans, that's 132 people, gave 60% of the massive influx, over $1 billion of SUPERPAC money that has been so well documented over the last 12 months. Less than 1% of Americans in the 2012 election contributed 68% of the political money. Why does this matter? It matters because As the disgraced lobbyist Jack Abramoff says, contributions from lobbyists and special interests to public servants are bribes. And that matters because 93% of the time, the candidate with the most money wins. In 2012, it was actually 95%. Now, you know some of the big statistics here. $7 billion in overall spending as reported by the Federal Elections Commission, 13,000 registered lobbyists, and an amazing American University study released 4 years ago that estimates some 90,000 people in the influence industry in Washington, D.C. But the fact is that campaign contributions and super PAC contributions, while you hear a lot about them, they're only just the tip of the iceberg. Outside lobbying firms, in-house lobbying, which has grown exponentially since the 1970s, massive advertising budgets, the revolving door, over 5,500 people, staffers and members of Congress have moved from Capitol Hill into K Street lobbying in the last 10 years alone. Corporate-funded think tanks, sponsored academic research, trade associations, of course, most notable, the Chamber of Commerce, the AstroTurf groups like the Koch brothers funded Americans for Prosperity, freelance press flacks who do spend most of their time trying to discredit folks like me, PR firms. This is the real ecosystem of influence in this country, and this is the real cancer. Now, what are the symptoms day to day? I thank my fellow panelists because they just did a phenomenal job of outlining these, so I'm going to go very quickly. Climate change, as of January 1st this year, we have no climate treaty in place and none coming as far as I can tell. Some of the best grassroots organizing in the country has been done by Sierra Club, 350.org, and many other groups, and yet we're seeing that the Keystone XL pipeline is likely, and no coincidence, $178 million lobbied for Keystone XL in 2012, $5 million against health care. 45 million Americans uninsured. The Obamacare, say what you like about it, it was certainly a whole lot more friendly to insurance and pharmaceutical companies than originally introduced or concepted. You have skyrocketing costs, and that industry's put in $233 million lobbying in 2012, the largest lobby in the country. All international reports commissioned by the UN and otherwise show the US medical system more expensive and less efficient than most developed countries. And then, of course, you have the ones that are just good to make you sort of cry at night. The things like, actually, is a Congressman, Eric Paulson, who introduced a bill to repeal a provision in Obamacare that would create a tax worth $20 to $30 billion on medical devices. The same day he introduced it, he got $5,000 from Boston Scientific Medical Device Company. That industry is his greatest patron. He's their guy. This one is a humdinger. The $500 million tax break that went to Amgen as part of the fiscal cliff deal. Most people don't even hear about this stuff. Stuffed into the bill at the last second. Gun control. This one literally brought me to tears. I'm one of the few genuine Jewish outdoorsmen you'll ever meet. I grew up, it's true, I grew up hunting and I really believe in people's right to have guns. But a 90% support for a bill that was introduced with basic, really bipartisan, watered down basic background checks. 90% of the country supports it, 74% of NRA members support it, yet it failed after the NRA outspent Brady, the association that's the largest fighting for gun control. And this was the scene that really was so sad for me. A congresswoman who had been literally shot in the head standing next to a grieving mother, and we couldn't get the most basic provisions into place. And this transcends across sectors. You name the issue, it is money that is blocking progress. And when we were looking at Lou's most recent presentation, virtually every graph that Lou was showing to you is actually not that hard to fix. These are common sense policy solutions that would make these graphs look a whole lot better. So what I'm here to do today is to appeal to you in this room to stop for a moment and acknowledge that we need to start fighting the cancer, not just the symptoms. We need to start fighting the cancer, not just the issues. We need to start fighting the corruption, not just the issues. So the question then is, what is the cure for corruption? Well, if you want to cure cancer, you need the right medicine, you need the right plan, and you need a lot of support. That's if you're a human. Now, if you are a country, a democratic and economic system and you want to cure corruption, you need the right proposal, you need the right political strategy, and you need a massive political movement. Okay, it's easy stuff. So I went to my private library and I asked myself, how do we do this? How are we going to fix this problem? And after all, Gus, when Gus opened this panel, he said, we're going to talk about the solution here. And it's, as you know, it's really hard to come up with real solutions. Most panels end up being descriptive because they are so elusive. We spent a long time, 2 years, racking our brains so that we could try to make this effort to get money out of politics look a little bit less like this and a little bit more like this. Because I am, and I put this in actually not as a laugh line originally, because I am obsessed with winning. And I came up with these 7 assumptions. Number 1, anything we do to fix this problem has to be transpartisan. It has to be cross-partisan for 2 reasons. Number 1, when Americans are asked how they self-identify, for the last 20 years, Gallup USA Today, 40% conservative, 35% moderate, and just 21% liberal. And these numbers have not changed appreciably over the last 20 years. Number 2, when you ask US adults, random sample, if they think Citizens United, the infamous Supreme Court case from 3 years ago that unleashed the torrent of SUPERPAC funding and secret funding, if that should be reversed, 76% of conservatives, 81% of moderates, and 85% of liberals agree it should. You have massive cross-ideological support for this notion that money should not buy political outcomes. And further, we saw evidence in California in opposition to Proposition 8 just a few years ago, a very successful campaign. Ted Olson, a conservative lawyer from the Bush administration, standing shoulder to shoulder in a cross-partisan effort that was successful. Number 2, nobody cares about campaign finance reform. Sorry, anybody who's a big advocate of that. What they care about is corruption. And a 2012 poll by Gallup amazingly asked the American people, what should the priority of the next president be? And the answer was, second was reducing corruption in federal government, second only to jobs. And what's equally notable about this poll is what corruption beat. It beat the deficit, terrorism, Social Security and Medicare, and health care. Number 3, we need comprehensive reform. Larry Lessig from Harvard, who I referred to earlier, said money in politics is a cancer, but cancer doesn't cure itself and it won't be cured by tiny little ideas. Indeed, if you look back at the arc of history, the biggest triumphs in this nation's history were not done by MLK, for example, standing up and saying, I have an idea for an incremental reform that might get us partway towards equality. That is just not how it was done. Now, if you look back on this issue, McCain-Feingold is the most notable of the last 15 years, introduced as actually a decent bill, but got butchered up through the process of the sausage making that is Congress, and came out actually quite weak. Today, you've got something called Fair Elections, the DISCLOSE Act, Grassroots Democracy Act. I'm not going to get into the details about the various piecemeal legislative proposals that are in the U.S. Congress, because this is the headline that we're greeted with literally at the commencement of every new Congress. Campaign finance reform in Congress moves forward with little hope for passage. Now, there is one thing happening that has some promise, we don't know, but in the next 7 weeks, the New York State Legislature is considering a comprehensive campaign finance reform and ethics bill that includes citizen-funded elections that could win. And so all eyes are on that, and I encourage you to keep an eye on that. Number 4, constitutional amendment is not enough. As I mentioned, Citizens United, which opened up the floodgates to political spending, a terrible decision by any account. There's been great grassroots organizing happening around the country with resolutions asking for states and cities and towns to resolve that they amend the Constitution to say that corporations aren't people or money isn't speech. There's different ways that they're trying to do this. Liberal groups are leading the charge. But remember, they need 2/3 of the U.S. Congress and 3/4 of the states to pass it. That means 13 states can block passage of any constitutional amendment. It's why the ERA, which simply said equality of rights shall not be denied on account of sex, died by 3 states in 1982. Now, if you consider that there's only one Republican who supports an amendment to the Constitution on this issue, 25 state legislatures that are fully Republican, 7 more split, and 30 run by GOP governors, then it is a long shot at best that a constitutional amendment will pass. And besides, even if it happened, there is still lurking just under the water a massive raft of different problems around money in politics that the amendment doesn't fix. Indeed, you still need to legislate. Number 5, politicians will only act if forced to. This, sadly, is the dynamic on this issue. There is no issue where you're more asking a fox to put a lock on the henhouse than with money in politics. And this, sadly, is the face of most reform advocacy efforts for the last 30 years. It's really true. We public interest people are nice. Like, you guys are nice. You don't want to do this. But the fact is, this is why the NRA has power. They have a demonstrated ability and willingness to remove from office whoever opposes them on anything. The background check, the watered-down version that lost in the Senate a few weeks ago, it lost because the NRA announced a week prior to the vote that they were indeed going to count that vote towards the NRA scorecard. And the members of Congress knew that they'd lose. It's no coincidence that the Tea Party rose to power in 2010 under the "just vote them out" tagline. This was a very intentional tagline. They knew that that's where their power would be derived from. Number 6, we need a massive movement. We need a path to victory on this issue that's been elusive. And people who are leading these issues, like the environment, get it. We've won every scientific battle, but we've lost most of the legislative ones because the system runs on cash. It's time for that to change. That's from Bill McKibben. This is the sentiment not just of environmental leaders, but across environment, media, taxation, financial reform, civil rights, government spending. They are all aware of this problem more so than ever, thanks to Citizens United, and they're all looking for a viable path to victory. Number 7, it will likely take a crisis to actually move this issue because of so many baked-in obstacles. Milton Friedman said, "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around." So a recap, I think I can finish this in a few minutes, Gus. Progressives won't win on this alone. Corruption is the message. You have to be comprehensive, not incremental. The constitutional amendment is not enough. Politicians must be forced. We need a massive movement, and it will likely take a crisis. So we need the right proposal, the right political strategy, and the right movement. When you look for the right proposal, sadly, this is what you see. No, it is. So, because this is a very, very complex issue, and anybody who has dived into money in politics, as soon as you start talking about the policies and the wonkery, you're immediately flooded with total confusion. So for the purposes of making this make sense to you, I want to break this down into 3 areas. Campaign finance and lobbying, and I'll add transparency. How are campaigns financed? What are the rules that lobbyists must oblige by? And what are the rules around transparency or disclosure? Then there are congressional rules, most notably recently, remember the discussion about the filibuster, the Senate filibuster? That would be a congressional rule. And election administration, who gets to vote, who doesn't, all largely administered at the states. For the purposes of what I'm talking about, we are tackling this issue from the perspective of campaign finance and lobbying because that is where the biggest problem is, and that is where the biggest potential for reform lies. So what we did is we said, okay, if we're going to fix campaign finance and lobbying writ large, nationally, how do we do that? So we went to the really smart people. We went to Larry Lessig, the professor. We went, now no booze, actually if you want to do booze and cat calls, you can. We went to Jack Abramoff, the disgraced lobbyist, who now, regardless of what he does and what his intentions are, Jack Abramoff has come out of jail and genuinely wants to try to at least make his name right and has committed himself to talking about these issues from a let's fix it perspective. So we sat down with Jack Abramoff literally in a room in Washington, D.C. and said, Jack, what kind of law is needed that could be constitutional that would stop you 7 years ago? And that was the starting point for the proposal that we came up with the lead author being the former federal elections commissioner, Republican Trevor Potter. He's most notably, of course, Stephen Colbert's lawyer too, which I figure I'd throw that in. Now, we came up with the American Anti-Corruption Act. The Anti-Corruption Act stops lobbyist bribery. It stops it actually prohibits politicians from taking monies from those they regulate. Imagine that. It prevents the revolving door from swinging for 5 years so that members of Congress and their senior staff may not go into the influence industry for 5 years instead of 1 for the House and 2 for the Senate. You call people who lobby lobbyists, meaning we actually make it so that if you lobby, you have to register, which currently you don't for so many influencers. We reduce the amount of money lobbyists can give by 80%, and we say you can't raise money while Congress is in session. Imagine that. Total transparency, everything is disclosed, and citizen funding. This is really important. This is creating what we call a voucher or a tax rebate, which says every American can get $100 that goes to any politicians or political parties of your choice. Now, some people have a knee-jerk reaction against this idea, but the reality is if you can't amend the Constitution, if you can't stop independent expenditures, and you frankly don't want to limit people's free speech rights in the first place, then you have to create another way to get large numbers of small donations into the system for what I would call a dilution strategy, a strategy to get a flood of small dollar, less special interest driven money into the system to balance the bad money. And you need that proposal, the American Anti-Corruption Act, and a couple others that are floating out there, to become the new normal, the new definition of what is reform. Now, the right political strategy, and I'm going to go very quickly because I'm running out of time. You have to go on offense. For us, that meant we introduced the Anti-Corruption Act, not to Congress. We're not going to do that for years. It's to the American people with a credible ballot of left-wing and right-wing people. We had Ted Roosevelt, the investment banker. We had a guy, Tom Whitmore, from the Tea Party. We had Mark McKinnon, a GOP strategist, standing up next to Larry Lessig and someone from Occupy Wall Street, and rolled out a bipartisan proposal. Then you enlist 1 million citizen co-sponsors of the Anti-Corruption Act to show that you have a real grassroots movement behind this bill. Currently, we have 360,000 people, and as we get bigger, you launch what's called the 435 campaign, getting every member of the U.S. House of Representatives on record as for or against the American Anti-Corruption Act. The idea here is to create a new binary for American politics. This is serious. I am so tired of Democrat versus Republican. I'm so tired of conservative versus liberal. And with all due respect to the congressman yesterday, I frankly don't agree that liberals believe in fairness and conservatives believe in merit, and it's that simple. Almost every liberal I know believes in both, and every conservative I know believes in both. So what we have to do is create a new binary so that politicians are either corrupt or they're anti-corrupt. It's simple. And if they're anti-corrupt, they endorse the American Anti-Corruption Act and they swear they're going to pass it. It's very simple. And then, crucial, working with other groups that have the ability and a track record to take down bad guys, we go into the next election cycles going forward, taking down members of both major parties who are unwilling to support the act. The goal for 2016, we want 150 congressional supporters, 1 presidential candidate to endorse the act. And then we have to build the political movement. And I know, Gus, I've already now said I'm almost done. I really am. But as we build the political movement, I want you guys to imagine for one moment that you are the typical American family. Okay. Now, this is really important because here's the problem. Historically, we go to the typical American family and we say, okay, well, we've got the American Anti-Corruption Act. It's got 10 provisions. It's going to fundamentally transform the system. It's going to end dependence, corruption. Let me tell you about that. And it's going to reclaim, and this is what you get. It doesn't work. We have to figure out a new way to organize the American people around this issue because it's too big of a leap. The way the DC wonk speak has tended to organize and talk about this issue. We polled over 20,000 Americans and asked them why they care about this issue of money in politics, and they care because they feel cheated and they feel ripped off. They want a country that represents them. They want a Washington that represents them. And that's why we've built this whole campaign that we're doing around this notion of we've had enough. We need something that is fun, that's sexy, that you want to wear on your shirt, that has celebrities involved, that is smart, that uses the speech bubble, because the biggest, most effective attack on campaign finance reform is this notion, this fallacy that it would restrict free speech rights, so you make the reform proposal all about the speech rights of the American people, and you build something that the American people can believe in. And you feed the grassroots, you do actions like we did a month ago in Washington where we all dressed up as $100 bills, and you literally run through Washington. You get people like Tom Whitmore from the DC Tea Party Patriots standing up next to progressives, and you create a feeling of fun and levity with kinds of responses we got from thousands of people who saw it online and hundreds who participated. In Albany, for the measure that I mentioned, we're going there with our money suits in 3 weeks, and we're gonna run through that town and see what kind of trouble we can cook up. We are postering the country with these posters that were written, were designed by a guy who does it for Dave Matthews Band and for the Grateful Dead and all these iconic bands. We're organizing at the grassroots around the 435 campaign starting this summer, and we're really trying to show people how this issue affects your issue. This slide I included because this was by far the most popular Facebook graphic that we've done on the environment. And I know some people might want these bears as doormats or over their fireplace, but most people don't. Most people want them to be able to survive. And we're also being edgy, and I just want to be candid about this. We're running a television ad in a couple months where we literally have this American politician who at the beginning of the spot looks completely stand-up, button-down, and by the end he's dancing in a kind of a dancing place with a pole, taking cash, wads of... taking wads of cash from the crowd. We're trying to create a campaign that feels more like this. And I just want to say one thing in closing. There is a but. There is a reality that there is a very strong feeling amongst a lot of really smart people about why bother. Why bother with this issue when it feels like it's really, even though like this guy Josh Silver came in and showed me this really impressive plan, it's the smartest thing I've seen yet on this issue, it's still impossible. It's still literally like an impossible task. But I would leave you with this notion that this issue is very much like an asteroid coming towards Earth. That if we don't fix this problem of money in politics, this Earth will not be sustainable in more ways than just the environment. So in many ways, figuring out how to stop it is just like that silly movie Armageddon, which you might remember with Ben Affleck, where the asteroid is coming to Earth and the government has to figure out a way to like save the planet. So they pick the least imperfect bunch of people who have the least imperfect idea. They happen to go up onto the asteroid, they set off a charge, they save the world. But that is really what this is about, is we have to do something, if not for us, then for people like my daughter Zadie. So I will leave you with this literally closing thought, Gus, and that is, I want you to consider yourself, think of yourselves as being like Ocean's 11, the movie, where I am a much less good-looking George Clooney, but this is a nascent campaign where I am literally going around the country finding smart, talented people who can help with strategy, organizing, introductions, yes, money, all of that, because I believe together, if we can get enough people, we can win this issue. Thank you.